A bizarre childhood encounter in a New England forest. What was it? Here's a little context. This happened when I was a child, and to this day, I really can't explain it. I'm going to tell the story as objectively as possible, without adding on my own interpretations, because I love to tap into some group intelligence and see what the readers think. I think it is important to mention that I am now 35 years old, and a very logical, evidence-based scientific person. I work as an analyst for a large organization and deal with information, statistics, and numbers. I'm a big follower of Occam's razor, and believe that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In case it is important, I'm a guy. I'm going to write this pretty quickly without too much editing, to cut back on too much editorializing, so forgive the lack of polish. This encounter occurred when I was about 6 years old in New Hampshire. At the time, my family was renting a renovated house that had been built in the 1700s. Some of the original house remained on the exterior. I recall a hole in one of the modern interior walls that one could peek through and see an 18th century toilet, which was on the second floor and was basically a wooden seat with a hole. The waste would fall down a vertical column in the wall and into a bucket that could be accessed through a small door from outside the house at ground level. Admittedly, an awesome place to live as a kid if you're the adventurous type, which I was. The property sat on 80 acres that included a large forest and a small pond about a mile back behind the house. My dad, sister, and I would often walk out to the pond, which entailed a 15-minute journey through the dense New England forest. We called it the Bond Beaver Pond, owing to many of the beavers that lived in the area. My sister is 2 years younger than I, so she was about 4 years old at the time. One day, the three of us made our usual walk to the pond in the early evening. Soon after we arrived at the pond, for some reason, I wanted to go back to the house. I don't believe it was anything unusual. I might have had to pee or something. As a kid, I was pretty particular about going to the bathroom in a real bathroom. My parents were a little overly proper, and I was a little neurotic about those things. Halfway along the pathway home, the forest had started to dim a bit, and I got uncomfortable, so I began to run. I'm not sure why. I wasn't looking in front of me. I might have been glancing to the sides and back as my paranoia mounted, and suddenly, bam! I ran into it. Shocked, I took a step back, and this is what I remember seeing. It was at least 3 times my height and stood on 2 legs. It was completely covered in long, gray-brown, slightly matted hair. Not fur, but hair. Similar to a human's. Think Cousin It. I recall it looked like a bit like a sloth, especially the head, that was walking upright on its hind legs with very slow movements, almost as if it were moving in slow motion. I don't remember any facial features. Its arms were held up, kind of like a kangaroo's front legs. Bizarrely, it had a red ribbon or bow around its neck. I didn't sense any malice or aggression from the creature. If anything, I got the feeling that it was surprised as I was. As soon as I got over my shock, I ran around it and continued running back to our house. I glanced back and saw it slowly turning its entire body around to look at me as I raced home. A couple days ago, I asked my mom if she remembered me telling her about the incident, and she did, and added a couple of details. She said that I did describe a face and eyes watching me, and that at some point it hid behind a tree to watch me. I don't recall this part. Epilogue. When I was 18 years old, I was watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries with my late father, and a segment about a Sasquatch sighting came up. After the segment, my dad told me that once, when we lived in New Hampshire, he took my sister in the family station wagon for a drive through the woods around our house. He said that at one point both he and my sister saw something brown race across the road in front of them. At first, I thought it was a deer, he said, but I quickly realized that it was a humanoid shape and stood on 2 legs, taking giant strides. I recently asked my sister about this, and she remembers it well. So, there you have it. I know all too well about my fallibility of memory, and readily admit that there were a lot of inconsistencies. I read Bo seriously, but I've documented exactly what I remember. No more, no less. At the time of the encounter, I didn't know anything about ghosts, monsters, or Bigfoot. I did, however, have an intense phobia of primate faces for the rest of my childhood, up until I hit adolescence. Some people have suggested I undergo regression hypnosis, but to be very honest, I'm a little afraid to. I can't shake the sense that there was more to the encounter that I can't remember or somehow lost. There could have been a perfectly normal explanation. In fact, this is most likely. However, I haven't been able to come up with anything that remotely makes sense, other than the whole thing being the overactive imagination of a child. So, to the thing I encountered in a New Hampshire forest as a child, I really want to know what you were, and wouldn't even be opposed to getting another look at you. Faceless deer. This might not qualify as paranormal by most standards, but I wanted to share it. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't normal. I'm from upstate New York in a moderately unpopulated area. I have a large wooded area behind my house which I frequently enjoy hiking through and tending to. Much of the area has been overrun by garlic mustard, a pretty horrible invasive plant that can quickly establish and take over an area in just a few years. So, I spend quite a bit of time out there in the warm months, pulling out as much of it as I can and trying to restore native woodland plants. It's a seemingly endless battle. Anyways, as I worked my way out through the woods, I noticed that there was Doe standing very close to me, about 25 feet away. She just stood there staring at me. I called out, "What are you doing?" to her a few times and clapped my hands, trying to get her to run off, as I didn't really like that she was so close and staring me down so intensely. It was funny at first, but seemed more and more off the longer she stand. She just stood there until I finished in the area, and then I drove away on my four-wheeler. Even the loud engine roar didn't scare her off. I looked back as I drove away and she was still there staring me down. About a half hour later, I was pretty far out in my woods transplanting some things, when I suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that I was being watched again. I looked around, and just across the small clearing I was standing by, I noticed some kind of weird beige-gray blob. Curious as to what it was, I walked closer. As I approached, it started to make more sense to me. It was what appeared to be a dead doe draped over the crotch of a tree. Something wasn't quite right, though. I struggled to fully understand what I was looking at. I could see the ears, I could make out the shape of the head, and I could even see tendons bulging out of the neck. Suddenly it hit me. I could make out the shape of the head. I was now about 15 feet from it, and I froze as I realized the deer had no face. There should have been dark spots for the nose and eyes, and there should have been a mouth of some sort. There was nothing. It was solid, short, beige fur. The best way to describe it was that it was a deer version of Slenderman, a totally featureless, smooth, furry head. I panicked. Despite that it was a warm, bright, sunny day, I felt like I was surrounded by darkness. Everything seemed quiet and eerie. Yet I felt something stirring from around the deer, though I don't think anything was physically moving. It's hard to describe. Really, it was probably just me panicking. I grabbed my stuff and got out of there as quickly as I could. Luckily, I had the four-wheeler with me, so I had a quick escape. Despite that this thing appeared to be dead, I felt I needed to get away from it fast. Looking back, I suppose it could have been some kind of weird hunting dummy, or perhaps just a dead deer with an abnormally monotone face, which had collapsed and stuck together. I've been tempted to venture back out there to examine it, but I get the feeling it'll either be gone, or just a disgusting pile of dead, decayed deer, neither of which seemed to make the hike worthwhile. I'm also still pretty creeped out by it, so I have little motivation to check back in. What do you think? Just an odd occurrence? Or could this be something paranormal? Silver fur, yellow eyes, arched back, and long fingers. This is a collection of 3 stories that didn't happen to me, but to some friends and some strangers. I heard these stories one after the other in a period of 3 months, and they all overlapped each other in odd ways. These are stories told to me a couple years back, so I'm sorry in advance if I'm not able to clarify it. The first involves my friend. We'll call him Mike, because that's his name. Mike and I have been friends for a long time, and he's always been one of the most skeptical people I've ever known. Deeply irreligious, he had a strong disdain for anything mystical or magical, and a couple of upside-down crosses tattooed on his body. One night, we were talking about the paranormal, about some of my family's experiences with apparitions and the long tale of my uncle's alleged alien abduction, to which he replied that he thought this was all bullshit. "I don't believe on none of that stuff," he told me. "Witches, ghosts, UFOs, all of it's fake, all of it. All of it except shapeshifters." "Huh?" I replied with a questioning tone. "Yeah, shapeshifters, skinwalkers. I've seen one. They're real, dude." I'd never heard about skinwalkers up until that very day. Then, he proceeded to tell me his tale. He told me all the myths and legends around skinwalkers, the Native American aspect of it, the shape-shifting, etc. Apparently, in the mid-2000s, there had been some mumbling around his town about people finding creepy shit up in the hiking trails by the mountains. I'm assuming that this was in Santa Barbara, because that's where he grew up, but I never asked. The murmurs around the high school were that there were some creatures who had frightened some hikers past the bridge that crossed the ravine, and a couple days later, a woman on an evening jog had stumbled upon a very large coyote. Mike and his friends decided to go into the canyons to check it out. The first trip took them all the way up to the bridge, and since it had been getting dark and they lacked flashlights, they decided to go back. They didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but did notice the lack of animals in the area. The second time, they took flashlights and made it past the bridge, onto the deeper part of the canyon. Again, they heard no birds, no coyotes, just utter silence in the dark canyon. The creek was dry as it was summer, so the sound of running water was also absent. They hiked for a good amount of time until eventually, someone heard some rustling on the other side of the ravine. Mike shined his light across the creek bed, and couldn't find anything. He scanned the opposite bank in search of the noise until one of his friends yelled out, "Stop!" Mike halted and his friends again told him, "To the left! I think I see something." Mike focused the light on 2 yellow dots across the ravine that were staring back at them. Suddenly, the dots started rising, and they caught the first glimpse of the creature. He stood well over 6 feet and covered in silver gray fur. The creature was facing away from the group, but looking back at them over its shoulder. It had silvery long fingers that came down to its hips, and contorted face features. He looked at them for a second, turning his body to reveal a plume of silver hair on its chest, and then moved into the brush without making a sound. The group was visibly shaken, but they couldn't say a word to each other, so they decided to make their way to the car. They began power walking and then trotting, and then eventually sprinting in a panic. Across the ravine, a thrashing could be heard as if the creature was making its way through the thicket. The group kept running, and the flashlight was dropped over the bridge, shattering. They made their way back to the car, where 2 of their friends had decided to stay as they didn't want to make the hike. From the car, they could see the bridge, and a shadow was standing in the middle of it. They got the fuck out of the Dodge, and as soon as they could, with the rest of their friends asking what the fuck had just happened. The story ends here, but Mike did tell me that some of his friends decided to go back up to the ravine upon hearing about the sighting. Allegedly, they saw the creature, and it chased them all the way to their car, and kept up with them until they exited the preserve, rattling its hands against a wire fence. That's the first part of the tale. Second part picks up 2 months later. I was touring with a friend's band through the southwestern US. We had arrived in Albuquerque that night, And after the show, we had got invited to a house party with some locals. There was a good amount of people, and they were just shooting the shit. Somehow, the topic of skinwalkers had come up. We had been messing around while in New Mexico and kept saying, "Don't say its name," whenever we could. Anyways, some of the partygoers had grown up on the reservations nearby, and one of these kids had actually seen one. Intrigued, I asked him to explain what he had seen. As a child, he had been walking in the res with his friend at night. Out of nowhere, his friend told him to keep walking. He asked him why, and he just said, "Don't look to your right. Whatever you do, don't look to the right." He told me that he nearly shat his pants while walking, and after a couple minutes, he gave in to his curiosity and looked back. On top of the roof of a house stood the creature, tall and skinny, shining a dull silver under the moonlight. Its long, skinny fingers dragged down as it paced back and forth on the roof of the house. He turned away and booked it, and refused to walk alone at night for months after that. The moment he said silver fingers, my heart sank. I've never been a believer in weird coincidences, and this is just so too weird to be a coincidence. I asked this guy if he knew Mike, and he said he never met him. The third story involved my friend Julie. Out in San Clemente testing out her new telescope, she had set up in the middle of a golf course near her house. Out of the corner of her eye, a black shadow emerged from the water. It looked at her with yellow eyes, stood up, and walked into the forest. Julie packed her shit and took off. So, over the course of 3 months, I've heard these stories. And the absolute worst feeling was the coincidences between them. I live near reservations here in California, and I refuse to get near them alone at night.